I want to invite you to join us on Monday, April 19th for a teach-in entitled Criminal Injustice, Race and Policing, Mohammed Noor, Derek Chauvin, and Beyond. Please find more about the Spring Teach-ins series we're organizing with ICGC and RIGS, the Race, Indigeneity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Initiative, on the ICW's Google site. Please also note that all of our workshops are recorded and available for future viewing on our YouTube channel.
Hello, my name is Karen Brown, and I am the director of the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change, or ICGC, a campus-wide center focused on global social justice that is part of the GPS Alliance at the University of Minnesota. We're really pleased to be working with our ICW colleagues on this important event today. Today's workshop, Race, Sports, and Politics, comes out of an ICGC doctoral seminar entitled Sports, Race, Protest, and Social Change, taught by Professor Douglas Hartmann, an ICGC-affiliated faculty member in the Department of Sociology at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. The seminar focuses on the extraordinary race-based athletic activism that emerged in the United States and all around the world in the wake of George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis in the summer of 2020. The goal of the course is to set this activism in historical context, evaluate its scope and significance, and begin to document unique local activists, angles, and issues at the intersection of sport, racial protest, and social change. Today's panel will explore these and other issues. So welcome, everyone. We look forward to spending the next 90 minutes with you. On Zoom, the chat is open. We invite you to use that space to share your thoughts and suggestions. The Q&A is also open. We've reserved the last 30 minutes for questions from the audience, but you are welcome to share these questions through the Q&A box as they arise. You can also open up the live transcript if captioning will make this program more accessible and enjoyable.
As always, we hope that the bridges we're building between scholars, students, community leaders, and journalists will strengthen the work that's happening across our cities and throughout the nation around racial justice. So, Professor Doug Hartmann is today's moderator, and he will have the honor of introducing the panel, and I will have the honor of introducing Dr. Hartmann. Doug Hartmann is professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. He is the author and co-author of several books. Among these are Midnight Basketball, Race, Sports, and Neoliberal Social Policy, Migration, Incorporation, and Change in an Interconnected World with Saeed Ali, and Ethnicity and Race, Making Identities in a Changing World with Stephen Cornell. His first book, Race, Culture, and the Revolt of the Black Athlete, the 1968 Olympic protests and their aftermath, has appropriately received renewed interest in light of the leading role Black athletes have played in recent racial justice movements, and converges with his continuing interest in these questions. Welcome, Professor Hartmann. Thank you for helping us to organize today's event, and I am looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Melinda. That was a great introduction, probably a nicer one than I'll do for all the panelists who I'm so excited to have here. But I'm going to introduce them in the order when it's their turn to speak. I do want to welcome everybody here. I'm just selfishly I'm so excited to be able to do this panel. We've got so much to talk about and such an incredible panel. We've got a journalist, an athlete activist, a graduate student who's been both an athlete and an activist, and a leading sports scholar. All these folks have amazing experiences and impeccable credentials, and I think will help us to think and put in perspective the activism, the social change that's happening right now in our communities, in some ways that are exciting, in other ways that are quite tragic. Who would have thought that we would be having this panel on the same week when we've had another instance of killing in the Twin Cities and new wave of protests and activism and righteous outrage, not only from the general community, but our athlete and athletic community as well. The title of this panel, this course is inspired by this that we're doing. This panel inspired by the activism that's come out around these social issues. We've got a course on this. I should let everybody know I'm working on a book on this. That's why it feels like selfish for me to be able to bring this group together to help me think about how to write about this and what lessons to draw. This particular panel we've got titled Sports, Race, and Politics. The course that we've been doing, which all of the panelists have been part of as presenters or students or facilitators, has focused more specifically on the protest side of things. Today, I'm hoping we can draw out some of the larger significance of protest and athletic activism with respect to politics and social change. So I invite each of the panelists to reflect on their own experiences with respect to sports, race, and protest, but also then to be able to put that in the larger context of what this means for the politics of American society, for social change in the United States, for activism and change on violence, on police brutality, on the terrible injustices of our criminal justice system, and in particular, sports' role and implication in all of that. So that's what we're going to try to do. One other way to think about it, sports and politics are the bookends and race is in the middle. In the middle, as it so often has been in American history, both in general and in the sports world. It's a lightning rod, a third rail of sorts that represents some of the highest ideals of the sporting world and some of our deepest stereotypes, stigmas, and tragedies. And I think it's not at all accidental that the activism and the change in our society and in sports that's happening is so focused around the realities, the tragedies, in some moments, the hope and promise of race in the world of sport. Our first panelist is going to be Dave Zirin, who's the journalist of the bunch. I should note he also, we've got panelists from the DC area, from the Georgia area, and from the Twin Cities. So this series has tried to bring into dialogue folks in all these different metropolitan areas. Dave's the sports editor of The Nation, one of the leaders, maybe the leader of our generation, of journalists willing to speak out with truth, with activism, and in service of social change and social justice. Dave, it's a pleasure to have you here. I know you've written on protest, on politics, on race and sport. Do you want to take a few minutes and maybe just give us your thoughts at the moment, both big picture thoughts about the history and the possibility and problems of these topics, and also just what you're thinking about these days. The other thing I want to mention, I'm so excited for the book you have that'll be coming out. It's called The Kaepernick Effect, if you haven't heard about it. It's interviews with athletes, high school athletes, college athletes, and pro athletes who've taken a knee over the last few years. And Dave, we're all excited to hear that book, and maybe that's even a place that you could start for us.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to talk about that. Thank you so much, Doug. Thanks so much for having me. I want to let folks know that, I went to college in the Twin Cities, Macalester College grad, and I just want to say all my solidarity with the Twin Cities in the fight against racist policing and for a world that can somehow resemble justice. I can't imagine the stress that you're under right now. Just know that we are marching in DC in solidarity with you. We're not just being passive bystanders to the tragedies taking place there. So let's talk some sports. Since the beginning of sports in this country, since the beginning of organized sports, there have been rebels. Colin Kaepernick, Royce White, Wright, just to name three. So I want to talk about that and why I believe Kaepernick achieved a certain impact and resonance. So why has sports always produced these rebels? I mean, you might have seen just today, Brett Favre, former quarterback of the Vikings, said sports and politics don't mix. He said that after a season where he was campaigning for Donald Trump, but that's what Brett Favre said. And for him to say that is ignorant of the entire history of sports. And I would argue that practically from the very beginning of organized sports in the United States 150 years ago, a contradiction was baked into the cake of sports. On the one hand, sports was billed in this country and marketed as the best possible expression of the United States. It was a message that said anyone, if they were good enough, would be able to take the field, that sports is the ultimate meritocracy. If you're good enough, you play, and if you're not, you're not. That was what was blared in the early marketing of sports. But on the other hand, in early sports 150 years ago, if you were a woman, no sports for you. If you were black or brown, form your own leagues or don't play at all, just stay out of our way. Now, that, of course, was a political decision to make sports have a message of inclusion, but a reality of exclusion. So from the very beginning, sports is a political space. And remember that for anyone like Brett Favre who says there's no politics in sports. It's always been political. Because then, as people of color, as women began in the 19th century to fight for access to sports, they immediately made it a contested space, a space where athletes demanded access and equity. So from the beginning, the very platform of sports becomes a space that's far more than just fun and games. It becomes a platform for both sides. It's been a platform for franchise owners and executives to express their beliefs, often which have revolved around hyper-patriotism, militarism, corporate rule, white supremacy. And it's also been a platform to express dissent against the way things are, not just in the sports world, but the real world. And that's why we can't think of the civil rights movement without thinking about Jackie Robinson, or the 1960s without thinking about Muhammad Ali, Tommie Smith, or John Carlos, or the women's liberation struggles of the 1970s without Billie Jean King, or the Black Lives Matter movement without that image of Colin Kaepernick first sitting during the anthem and then taking that fateful knee almost 5 years ago. Now, why has Colin Kaepernick had a particular resonance? Why are we even still talking about him? And that's the next part of what I'm going to talk about, because I think that actually opens the door a little bit for understanding where we are in 2021. Now, some of the reasons why we still talk about Colin Kaepernick, some of those reasons are obvious. You know, there was a movement in the streets, first and foremost, willing to support and connect with him. Remember when Colin Kaepernick took that knee in August of 2016, I mean, you know this in the Twin Cities very well. He did not do that in a vacuum. He did it after the police killings and the videos being released on back-to-back days of Alton Sterling and, of course, Philando Castile. He did it after the several years of a Black Lives Matter movement had been built. So there was a movement off the field, which he was able to amplify. And if you look at the history of sports and protests, there's always a movement off the field that gets amplified on the field, and then athletes can then shape that movement off the field. So that was one reason why I think Colin Kaepernick's had this impact, is because there was a movement that he was connected to through the very imagery of him taking that knee during the national anthem. The second reason, of course, is that the NFL is the closest thing to a national religion that we have in this country. And Colin Kaepernick is a quarterback. So you're talking about the most popular sport, and you're talking about the most important position in the most popular sport. And that gave him a platform because of the way football is prized in our culture. That made it a discussion point when it wasn't a discussion point when the WNBA made similar protests that summer, wearing black shirts during the anthem. That part we don't speak about the way we speak about Kaepernick. And one of the reasons for that is sexism. One of the reasons for that is the way football is prized in our culture. And the other reason why we talk about Colin Kaepernick is that the NFL in particular is a particularly hyper-patriotic operation. And he took the hyper-patriotism of the NFL and he turned it on its head. Because since 9/11, that's September 11th, 2001, as Howard Bryant wrote in his book, The Heritage, the league had basically become an arm of the Pentagon, basically in its support for the war on terror. And here he was saying, okay, well, if this is going to be this political space every time the anthem plays, with the NFL getting paid by the Pentagon for playing the anthem and doing like all this ceremony around the anthem, well, then I'm going to use that space to say there's a gap between what this country says it is and the lived reality of Black Americans. Now, another reason why Kaepernick's had this resonance, and this is where we get to my book, The Kaepernick Effect, is that it was a gesture that allowed for replication. And that really is what my book's about. I interviewed dozens of young athletes who took a knee, and what I learned was truly fascinating. And I'm just going to say a little bit of what I learned, and then I'll stop talking. I learned, first of all, that these young athlete activists, they didn't do it just because Colin Kaepernick did it. they were not copycats following a trend. They did it because they were brave and because there had been police violence in their own communities, or in some cases in their own families. They also did it because this is a generation that has suffered generational trauma. We are talking mental health generational trauma. Growing up in a society that's hyper-militarized post 9/11, hyper-militarized in their schools, with metal detectors post Columbine in '99. They've grown up knowing nothing but surveillance and militarization. And then they suffered a generational trauma with the February 2012 killing of Trayvon Martin. The folks I spoke to, he was their Emmett Till. I mean, the way people in the civil rights movement speak about Emmett Till as being a moment that they couldn't turn away from, and they had to act, a moment that even Muhammad Ali said scarred him because he looked at Emmett Till's face and saw his own when Muhammad Ali was, I believe, only 11 or 12 years old at the time. And it's similar with Trayvon Martin, with the people I spoke with, that Trayvon Martin is killed by George Zimmerman when a lot of these 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds, they're only 10, 11 years old. And so for them, they had it in their hearts that they needed to act. And I think what Kaepernick did, and I think this is his greatest accomplishment, it hasn't been his words or his speeches or his stances, but he provided a language for protest for this young generation of athletes, taking that knee during the anthem. He also demonstrated that the space of the athletic field could be a place that could be claimed for a community protest. And oftentimes when these athletes took a knee, you had people in the stands booing, sometimes throwing things, but also you had people in the stands taking a knee with them or applauding the athletes ourselves. And as Doug has written in his work, you know, in our hollowed out cities that have been hollowed out by modern economics, late capitalism, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, these athletic facilities are some of the last community spaces. And, you know, nature abhors a vacuum. So this space was claimed for protest partly because of a lack of other spaces to claim. And I would argue that the young people who took a knee from 2016 to 2019, and believe me, we're talking about thousands of young people in this country, even though it didn't get media coverage, they laid the groundwork for the demonstrations that took place last summer after the police murder of George Floyd. And sports, once again, as it has for over 100 years, acted as a weather vane, letting us know what's going on. We didn't listen. I think people are listening now, but we would do well to not only listen, but remember that this isn't what's happening right now in 2021 in terms of the anger that people have, the frustration, the marching, the rage, that it all comes from a very righteous place that has a long tradition, and we've seen signs of it for years. So we need to understand sports, a weather vane, lets us know which way the wind is blowing, and we would do well to listen.
Thanks so much, Dave. And pretty good on time. You're well within the parameters. So I'm glad I didn't have to. You said I should cut you off if I need to, not even close. So thanks a lot. Great start to get us thinking. Our next speaker is going to be Royce White, somebody who's been part of that weather vane, part of signaling to society what to pay attention to on a number of different issues, but especially last summer here in the Twin Cities. Royce, pleasure to have you here. I know you were in the class earlier, and in the class, I just want to let everybody know we read some of the things you've written, including a letter to the governor that talks about politics and protests. But if you could maybe give us a little bit of your sense of what happened in the streets last summer, what that said about our political systems, about our public policies, what you think about those things, why you took to the streets, and how your background as an athlete was so important to that, and so important to the folks you're trying to organize and move forward with. That'd be fabulous. I'll turn it over to you. We're shooting, 12, 13 minutes. I'll try to keep you to that, but I know you got a lot to say, so I'll turn it over to you now. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Doug, you're probably gonna have to stop me.
Okay,
Dave,
I'll set a clock.
good to see you, Dave. Always good to hear from you, man. Appreciate your time today, and everybody else in the panel. Well, first, I think I'd like to just say that, we are in another time of real resistance right now. And so I I apologize if I seem a little distracted right now, right? Because, to us, and I'll touch more on this when I talk about 10K and last summer and those things. I know to me, but also to the people that are very close to the organization, the response to these types of injustices is not something that we take lightly, and it's not something that's easy to carry out and go through. And continue to stick with, given what we're up against. So, I apologize if I seem a little distracted today, because today, tomorrow, and I'm sure the days to come will probably continue to grow in tension and drama and chaos. So, the foundation. Well, number one, I come from the background as Dave has been involved with himself as a journalist many times of fighting back against the NBA a few years before Colin Kaepernick took a knee. And the premise of that fight was around mental health policy. And my statement to the NBA, or my claim to the NBA, was that mental health is the greatest social issue that humanity faces, being that it is the most encompassing social issue that not only is mental health the place where our ability to interact with each other stems, but our ability to exist as an individual, that spending time in your own head is that you are the person you spend the most time with during a day for most people, inside your head. And that given that there's no way that a corporation as big as the NBA, as well supported, well resourced as the NBA, as well read and well policied on medicine and the human body as the NBA, should not have a mental health policy, right? That it was abhorrent. And at the time, I really believe that it might have been an oversight. And what I come to learn and what I come to figure out by talking to the people behind the scenes, that it wasn't an oversight, that it was a very intentional move for the NBA not to have mental health policy. And furthermore, that intentional move was not only a reflection of archaic white owners in the NBA community, but a reflection of the global corporate community. And that the NBA and all of its tangential sponsors and partners were actually one of the best representations of the morality of our global corporate community. And for a few reasons, as Dave touched on, the race piece was obviously baked into the inception of sports here in America. But if you look at sports in America and sports at large, I think one of the most important elements of sports is that all of the people who come to it come with the expectation that it's a fair game, that there's an honesty to it, right? That cheating, that not only do you have to win in order to be great, but you have to win without cheating. And that can't be said for all of the areas or domains in our modern society. There are many areas where cheating is accepted, one being corporate America and the corporate domain, where getting ahead and cheating another business person out of a deal is commonly accepted. So, the mental health policy not being in the NBA and not being across the sports world was a factual microcosm of mental health policy being absent in the corporate world. And so that was the fight that I came from. Now, the absence of mental health policy and the rejection of me as a young Black man being the one to bring it forward gave me the template of racism as I navigated that situation. And I was forced to look at it from the perspective of a Black man because of the historical context of America, because of the historical context of the NBA and sports in America, and the current condition of America, of Black men in America as it pertains to the corporate culture and the overarching influence that corporate culture has on communities through political lobbying and other mechanisms. So, like I said in the class, if you were there, and I'll say it again, I just recently finished a letter to Lebron James, which ended up being 30 to 40,000 words, and we turned into a book, which we self-published on Amazon. In the book, I kind of had been going through this process already a year before George Floyd was murdered. And in the book, me and Lebron have a conversation, I pose that he and I had this long conversation about multiple things throughout society. The new technocracy, Lebron, what it means to be a Black activist, what it means to be falsely awake, the topic of Zionism and the comment that Donald Sterling made about Black Jews and Black Jews being treated like dogs and the failure to respond in an adequate way for NBA players at that moment. Colin Kaepernick, I have an extensive chapter on the Black bourgeoisie. So, there's all of these things that I pose to talk about with LeBron James. And I had been writing this book for a year. And I've been going back and forth on and off of finishing it, thinking about things. And then COVID hit. Okay, so when COVID hit, I had already begun to write a chapter about China as I became aware of the situation with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And I started to look more into China. And right around that time, ironically, my former general manager of the Houston Rockets, Daryl Morey, had begun to hit the news or the mainstream airwaves for his role in the controversy in China. And I know Daryl Morey to be crooked. I know Daryl Morey to be a liar. I know Daryl Morey to be somebody who's generally not a person who tilts towards being very humanitarian or very humane or very respectful towards players in general, but especially the Black players. So in that situation, I found myself actually kind of agreeing with his stance on China and supporting Hong Kong's protest. So I found myself in this weird position where I had to take a step back and look at my book. And we had just gone into lockdown with COVID. And, me being somebody who has anxiety disorder, which is how I came to be a mental health advocate in the first place, was being diagnosed with anxiety at 16. I had a problem with, I had big anxiety issues when COVID first hit. Number one, because I had been following it since January when it first broke out in Wuhan. But number two, because by the time it hit here, I thought we would have a better grasp on it from a scientific standpoint, even though all of the word from Wuhan is that we wouldn't have a better grasp on it, but I wanted to believe that. And so when it hit and it became so immediate, my anxiety just kind of took over, which made me then go back and look further at my book and consider, if this was going to be this huge cataclysmic pandemic that would rock the world to its foundations, what had I done? What did I left? What did I contributed? What was I leaving behind if I was to fall victim to COVID and all of these things? And so as I was looking back through the book, going over it, writing on a daily basis, dealing with my own anxieties, thinking about life in the most existential ways, George Floyd gets murdered right out on 38th in Chicago, a neighborhood that I grew up in, played basketball in, ran around the neighborhood in. And, it seemed that what I had been writing to LeBron James about and what I had called LeBron James to do in the overall summary of the book was to really consider what it means to be a Black man in this country and what that means as far as being a Black man in the world, and what is the next chapter for us as Black athletes. And to summarize this before I get into 10K, what I suggested was that, as James Baldwin put it so well, the reconciliation of the West will fall on America's ability to make right the original sin against Black people in this country, and primarily Black men. All Black people, but definitely a huge emphasis on Black men. And that because we are so uniquely positioned within the dynamic between the corporate world and the people, the citizens, that the Black male athlete has not only a perfect opportunity, but almost a duty to really think about how they can be most impactful. And so it calls us to think about what leadership is. And it calls us to think about what the real, what the most important role, the most important elements of being a leader is. And, what I came to was self-sacrifice, which happens to be a Judeo-Christian value that the West was built on. But I think we've strayed from it a bit, not only on an individual level, but a systemic level. First and foremost, a systemic level, also an individual level, and certainly at a community level, and even in our Judeo-Christian establishments or institutions such as the church. But I do believe that when we're talking about leadership, that the value of self-sacrifice is everything. And that if we're going to talk about self-sacrifice as it pertains to Black men who are in unique positions as professional athletes, then we have to talk about how are we risking or sacrificing or using our own, position to push back against the status quo, even if it's at our own expense. And how had LeBron James done that? And how could he potentially do that? How could we look back at his predecessors of very prominent, influential Black athletes and how they did it and how to decipher between those? You take a Michael Jordan versus a Muhammad Ali, or an Arthur Ashe versus some other guys. And so that's kind of the dialogue that we had. George Floyd was murdered. And I thought to myself, everything I'm saying to LeBron James in this book, I now have the opportunity to go do, right? What could I possibly do here in my own community more locally where I'm not as popular as LeBron James, and certainly, not LeBron James in stature or influence, but here in my own community, I do know enough other Black men, enough other Black athletes who are influential to shoot out a text and say, it's time that we go to the front lines. And I believe that's where we belong. I believe that a real actionable response is where Black men belong in this pushback against tyranny. And so my lens with LeBron James was about leadership. My history was about mental health advocacy, mental health being the human condition. I want to preface that. But the response to George Floyd became much more political. And Doug and I have talked extensively for hours about the political philosophy behind 10K, which kind of just developed organically, as I'm out there on 38th in Chicago and I'm watching the cops lob tear gas and flashbangs and rubber bullets and all of these other military tactics that they're using on what were peaceful protesters. And I think the day that it really clicked for me was as protests started the morning of May 28th, I want to say, the third day, the night that the fires really caught that night in the neighborhood. That morning, I was there, and the protesters had started off peaceful. And as the tear gas and things had started to hit the crowd, the protesters had taken the shopping carts from Target and created barricades out in front of the precinct. And as I saw the waves of protesters fall back from tear gas, rubber bullets, et cetera, and then come back, I really started to understand or started to form my own opinion that would influence the foundation and us hitting the front lines on the I-35W bridge and all of these other things. And to put it bluntly, keep it short, is, the state is out of control. They have a monopoly on violence. They're willing to use that monopoly. They're willing to change the rules as necessary. Our justice system is not a justice system, obviously, partially because the laws have double standards that apply first and foremost to Black men, but also to all citizens. There are plenty of other people who aren't Black who fall victim to a corrupt justice system as well. And so we really started to hone in on the message for 10K of being one about the free people of America versus the United States. And that this monopoly on violence, this modality of tyranny was something that had roots, obviously, in America, but was something that was taking place around the world. And that the reason why people have hit the streets the way that they have, in my opinion, and many of the Black men who influence this foundation, is not only about George Floyd and Black men being murdered. It's not only about Black people being killed, because that's been happening so long. It shouldn't have taken George Floyd for us to be this angry. What it was also about, and Doug and I touched on this, COVID-19 played a huge factor in people feeling very distrustful for the first time in our generation, in my lifetime, but in many people's lifetime, where an illness that needed reassurance from a government that we all know to be corrupt, the reassurance that we wanted and needed and couldn't get but at the same time told to stay in our homes, which many of us weren't prepared for. And then to witness a Black man killed, which is as normal and basically business as usual, catalyzed an entirely different spirit, rightfully so. And I think the tyranny of the state was on display during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think it peaked in George Floyd's murder, and we couldn't reconcile it. As a Black man, as anxious as I was about COVID-19 and the fact that high anxiety produces trouble breathing and chest palpitations and aches and muscle tensions, and that I was trying to parse that with all of the symptoms of this new mysterious disease, there was no way that I was going to stay in my home and not participate, organize, and lead a response to such a blatant murder of a Black man, right?
Hey, Royce, can I interrupt you there? And I got to say, having spent hours interviewing you about these things, it's pretty amazing you've got it down in a nice type presentation.
I don't know how I did that. I was nervous about even being able to accomplish that. So that's really all I have to say.
Well, especially in this week that I know you've been so active and doing all kinds of other stuff. So thanks so much for getting us started with that and a summary of so many things that you've been thinking about and working on. We'll come back into some of those for sure in a bit. I've always especially cherished, by the way, the depth of your political thinking on this and how protest and organizing fits in. So we'll probably elaborate on that a little bit more. At this point, I do want to turn over, though, to Mikkel Wright, who's a student in the class that we've been doing. So she and I have been talking a lot, but she is also somebody who's got a tremendous background as an athlete, as an activist, and is now really emerging scholar, the next generation who's going to help us figure these things all out. And I'm guessing it's going to be her book that will really tell the story about how sports, race, protests, and politics all fit together. So the preamble today, Mikkel, if you could get us started for the project that we all are spending our lives working on.
Okay, thank you, Doug. I always say, speak it into existence, talk about my book and all the things that I'm going to do one day. That's the goal, right? So just about me, I think, going back to what both Dave and Royce have said, it's been a week, right? It's been a month, it's been a year, and it just keeps going. And it's hard, it's hard to sit here and have these discussions while living it, real life. I turned my camera off because there's National Guard around our entire department and what that means in this moment. So just going back, I always start with like my athletic experience. I played Division I basketball for UC Santa Barbara, and it was what people want it to be. I had the athletic perks. I have the athletic, the knee surgery to prove it. I had the whole wide range of athletic fun. But I think of specifically my senior season in kneeling, post Kaepernick. But I always tell people, yeah, we absolutely had a long discussion about kneeling and what that meant to us after Kaepernick. But I will never forget, I laugh because this is full circle for me, watching Maya Moore, Simone Augustus, Rebecca Brunson, Lindsay Whalen stop their interview to say, after Philando Castile, to say, you know what, you've seen the game. You've talked about the game. You've talked about the whole game while we played. But today we're going to talk about something else, justice for Black lives, the killing of Black lives, that can't continue. What that meant in that moment, right? What that meant to then know that police officers left their games and weren't going to support them at their games. And then, we look at, I go in like, okay, so how do I want to approach this? Like we kneel, we deal, Dave mentioned it a little bit. We deal with, being outcasted. We deal with fans not wanting to be involved. We deal with people throwing things on the court. That's real life. That really did happen. But then what happened next, right? Like, yeah, we made a plan forward, but what that meant for me was, what I would do next. I continued my work. I was interested in it. And then I had a unique experience last summer with George Floyd. I always say, we've all unfortunately watched it on TV, seen it on online, on Twitter, on Facebook. But it hits just a little bit different when it happens where you are, when it happens down the street from you. Like Royce mentioned, like it happened in my neighborhood where I grew up. I didn't know what I would say or what I would do. I went to a couple marches and I felt anxious and nervous, and I went to a march where moms of whose kids were victims of police brutality, and I cried. It was a lot. So I gave back in a different way. I went to some marches, but I raised over $8,000 for community resources, and I remember people, being so grateful to get Kool-Aid jammers. They were like, you know what, the kids are really gonna love this. So grateful to have like some candy, right? But also shampoo, like just the things that we also so often take for granted. So I think what I'm really focused on right now, in the class, something I'm interested in is just understanding the value and work that we've seen women, specifically in the NBA, I mean the WNBA, but Black women in the WNBA and what that means moving forward. We know the rap that the WNBA gets, if I'm being honest, the lack of respect they get on all fronts. But what we don't talk about, we always talk about, I still see jokes about how women, they shouldn't be playing basketball, they should be in the kitchen. Those things like that, maybe it's never going to go away, I don't know. But what we need to start talking about more is the impact that the WNBA has. Very broadly, we look at, our Senator Warnock and what that means. Before Vote Warnock shirts in the WNBA, his polls were at 9%. They went from 9% to 14% to 19% to 28% to him winning. I would stand on a hill to say that doesn't happen without the WNBA. We know about Warnock, but not people go automatically, who's Warnock? Why are we voting for him? What does that mean? That picked up more traction than the things that Kelly Loeffler said, who ended up being his opponent, right? So the WNBA has a major role and contributes in a way that they just don't get the credit for. Specifically last summer, I'm really interested in I guess, really looking at the cohesiveness of the WNBA. We saw the WNBA and the NBA, react and, follow through with social justice initiatives and movements and, commentary from key players, right? But it wasn't all the NBA. We had some people who didn't want to wear shirts, some people who didn't want to change the names on their jersey. All 144 women in the Wubble last year participated. They were on one accord. They were organized. They worked together. They, contacted and tried to communicate with Kimberly Crenshaw and Breonna Taylor's mother, right? Kimberly Crenshaw went back and said, this is a breakthrough. I can feel it, knowing that the WNBA promoted Say Her Name in the way that they did. They, it wasn't just, oh, let's all do whatever. They read up, they partnered with Say Her Name. They communicated with people in charge, right? They dedicated their season to Breonna Taylor, but they also went on to say, this is for Sandra Bland, this is for Rakia Boyd, this is for Michelle Puzo. These are for the names that we don't know. I tell people that Breonna Taylor is, we look at Breonna Taylor as equivalent to George Floyd. But when you do a quick, data search, George Floyd got 20,000 plus Google searches. Breonna Taylor got 6,000. And, that's our marker. Breonna Taylor, that's the kind of ground we want Black women and their deaths by police to be covered. And the WNBA did that. Their Social Justice Council, they want to move forward. We don't want this to be one season. We want to continue to say her name. We want justice, but we also want people to pay attention and listen and learn and continue to move forward with us. I think for me, I'll wrap it up, and because I'll go on and on and on. I want people to remember that Black men are dying at a high rate to police brutality. We've seen it countless times. I don't even have the words to explain how it feels. But in that, we also know Black girls as young as 7 have been murdered by police. Black women as old as 93 have been murdered by police. It's you know, it happens to Black women at an alarming rate, and we don't hear about it. We don't talk about it. It doesn't get the same coverage as it should. Honestly, I think when we're looking at the WNBA, it is telling that a league with a women's league, right? A league with majority Black women are doing the things that they're doing. And it is also telling that, you know, Black Lives Matter starts with 3 Black queer women who are demanding to make some change, right? We see a pattern, right? And we always need more people on board. So thank you for letting me, you know, talk a little today. And yeah.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you here, part of the class. Your insights and experience is enriching for us all. I have this great privilege of getting to interact with all these folks. I'm taking notes, I'm making quotes. I'll be using all those things. One of the other great privileges when you organize a panel is other people have to do a lot of the work. And some of the work now is going to fall to Mary McDonald, my brilliant colleague from Georgia, who I know has just incredible ability to put things in perspective, to give some perspective, some synthesis. And in particular, Mary's especially well known for not theorizing so much resistance and protest, but power, domination, privilege, and how they perpetuate themselves. So I think that's part of what she can bring to the panel of thinking about the politics here, the power involved, how we push back against it, but then also what we're always fighting against. I don't know exactly how she'll pull it together, but I know she will. Mary, you want to take it away? Oh, I got to get you unmuted though.
Thank you. I'm really humbled to be here. I think if we've heard from the folks who've spoken to this point, I think we're really talking about power, and we're talking about how does social change come about? How has social change come about historically? And I think we got kicked off with Dave quite nicely to show that sport has always been about exclusion. So all this myth and romance around sport, if we look historically, we can actually see that it has built around mythos that promoted exclusion, whether it be about myths about women's body not being able to handle the rigors of sport, or African Americans at one point thinking that they couldn't take a punch in boxing, to then mythos around the superiority, the alleged natural superiority of Black bodies. We see that sport has not simply reproduced the cultural relations around it, but in many ways it has also constituted them as a major institution in our culture. And I think about Royce's comments too about in this moment that we're in right now, that is very much around capitalism, very much around the power of the state, very much around militarization. And so the forces of power seem to be significant and fairly embedded and strong. And yet we have a multiracial coalition of folks in the street, African-American led multiracial coalition of people in the street, right at the moment when these forces are coming together. And I think that this speaks also to something that each of the panelists have thought about and sort of brought in, that there's always been resistance, there's always been protests, there's always been the rebels. And perhaps, as Royce suggests, maybe athletes are uniquely positioned, not just historically because we've seen the fact that they've used their platforms, but sort of uniquely positioned between the corporate world and the public, because they do come from diverse communities. And Black athletes, both men and women, have felt the strain of militarization on their communities, particularly those who are from working class backgrounds. So they have sort of what I think might be thought of as sort of that outsider within, sort of never really fully being embraced by sort of the white supremacist culture around them or the patriarchal culture around them. And yet having that double consciousness that Du Bois spoke about, sort of seeing themselves in relationship to those dominant structures and be thinking about how they can move those dominant structures. And I think Mikkel nicely sort of put this all together in terms of on the ground activism and how people in the WNBA, even though they're sort of in this cultural space, and even though they're sort of in a cultural place, sort of have that outsider within status, that they're never fully embraced by the public more broadly. And yet they still have experiences that make them know that there is something to push back against, that it's a matter literally of life and death, and also of opportunity of and reward, of mental health, of safety itself. So I think we can see these things in relationship to the synergies of Black Lives Matter more broadly. We could take us back also more recently to people fighting around Occupy Wall Street too, to be thinking about some of the precursors to Black Lives Matter. We can think about the civil rights movement. So we are in this sort of synergistic space where people of variety of places have very much thought about, as Royce said, we're in the COVID moment, and that we see corruption around us and we see lack of care, where we see monetary, the economy in many places have been privileged over life itself, and the corruption about that and the falseness of that. And the fact that that is not a new situation, as white supremacy has always been about corruption, about not valuing life, and that people are putting those things together to move into the streets. And then but we also hear about the toll on that in terms of the mental health, in terms of just the dailiness of, as Mikkel said, people throwing things at you or shouting at you. So I think in that space, we do bring us back to what Dave sort of set us up to, sort of the limitations and the possibilities, the both ands that people are working with. And I know for somebody who's studied sport for a while, who was getting very uninterested in sport because it seemed to be overly corporate, to see that it becomes very much about the status quo, sort of the Michael Jordan, Republicans buy shoes too, so I'm not gonna support Hardy Gantt in his case against the segregationists. It seemed very much to be about post-1960s, about this sort of buying into the corporate and to be thinking about individualism. But I do feel like the rupture that we see in sport, the kneeling of Kaepernick, the folks in Minnesota who are on the ground, Royce writing his letter to Lebron, Mikkel talking about what her kneeling meant. I do feel like we are in a rupture. I think we are in a ruptures that have always happened. Perhaps these are more visible because we do have social media to document these ruptures that have always been there. And I do feel that athletes have given us models, whether it is just because the power of the symbolism of the kneeling. I mean, that's, you know, even if you're not Christian, you can imagine the iconographic images of kneeling in Christianity. You can think about kneeling next to a wounded soldier. You can think about taking a knee when you're tired on the field. So something about the symbolism of that in some ways is very clean, much as Carlos and Smith's Black Power salute was very much clean, just as they went on the stand with socks and didn't have shoes on, necklaces to talk about the history of lynching. That was all very much symbolic and clean, but that also gave something to communicate what was being felt and what was being felt deeply. So the power of a gesture, but to not keep it at the level of the gesture, to try to use one's labor, even if it is for a moment when the Milwaukee Bucks remove their labor, even if they threaten to remove their labor about Sterling, even as the WNBA in the wake of Jacob Blade's shooting had to negotiate, as Mikkel said, whether they were literally going to play or not. They were organizing and working across difference. So in this sense, we can see a window into what's happening more broadly, but it definitely is about the synergies. This doesn't happen without people in the streets more broadly. This doesn't happen without longer legacies of organizing that are endemic to America. And so I just sort of bringing all those pieces together. I'm very much humbled to be on this panel with people who have such great insight. And hopefully I brought a few of those threads together, also with the sport literature. And so all in there.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Mary. For you and all the panelists, I so appreciate not just your analysis, but the emotion and passion and commitment that HU is bringing to thinking about these things seriously, even in a moment of tremendous trauma, crisis for all of us. So thank you for that. I'm hoping we'll get a few questions in the chat. I'm also thinking maybe the panelists, if you want to suggest a question for each other, that'd be cool too. I want to start with one, and I don't know, Mary, maybe you want to pick it up, but others could too. It was powerful for me to hear you speak about kind of almost like a renewed hope in sport. I was thinking that as scholars, but also just as fans and participants, and it was seeming flat, right, and corporate and part of the status quo. And I heard you speaking to opening up some new possibilities there. I wonder if you could expound on that a little bit, but also, you know, coming back to the point Dave started us with about the relation between sport and politics. I'm wondering if you think it's sport that's changing or politics that's changing. One thing that often strikes me about this is that sports and politics opposition, I always thought the weird part of that wasn't the sports, it was what counts for politics. You know, like the national anthem isn't political. Military flyovers, that doesn't count for military. You know, and then somebody kneeling, that's politics, not like a supplication act of morality and humility. Anyway, Mary, if you wanted, since you had kind of started by thinking about your opportunities to rethink sport here, if you could expound on that a little bit and maybe connect that back to politics, which you've written on so frequently and eloquently in your career.
Oh yeah, thanks for that rewrite. It's probably a little bit better to say that sport probably has leg behind the politics. And I think some of us have already sort of said that on this panel. But as a scholar of sport who actually did a dissertation on Michael Jordan, and part of why I wrote that dissertation on Michael Jordan was, why am I compelled to like Michael Jordan, even though he's fairly, and he's pretty much publicly apolitical. He identifies as an athlete, not as an activist, even though people are trying to put him in that box. And we could talk about the politics of all that in terms of who's asked to be an activist and who isn't. But I mean, I think that's where it started. How am I interpolated into some of the dominant discourses around sport, which he clearly was projected as somebody who would be palatable to white audiences, that he was projected off the court as being sort of a family man, but hyper competitive. And of course, he was a great basketball player, so we can't leave that out. So just to be thinking about the marketing of sport and how it tries to build audiences, and historically that has been very much conservatively oriented. And again, it used to be the axiom of a sport, much like advertising, you didn't want controversy, right? Because that could disenable half your audience. But I do agree that the culture has moved around sport. And again, I read up quite a bit about the WNBA, and they clearly from their start were trying to like not advertise they had queer people in the league, which of course everybody knew they had queer people in the league, but they were trying to be very palatable to sort of an imagined consumer. And that certainly didn't work for their marketing, as well as just maybe trying to let the players be themselves. But just seeing the evolution in the WNBA, but realizing that this doesn't happen without a broader social movement, just as Carlos and Smith doesn't happen without the civil rights movement. So the synergies between those two that help constitute each other. And those who have studied sport history know that sometimes sport really does lead. We could think about Jackie Robinson in the case of desegregating baseball. In some cases, sport led in that case, but that was because people pushed Major League Baseball to do that. That's because people came back from the war and said, we took your bullets, why can't we take your baseballs? and because there was an economic incentive to open up. So the synergies there, I think, are more the important thing. But it is a wider cultural shift. It is because people went in the streets, Black bodies went in the streets and threw themselves on highways years ago, before George Floyd even happened, that we had that activism on the ground that pushed upward to other folks and got people thinking, got athletes thinking, because they were in conversations too. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. There's a couple questions in the chat. I'll get to those momentarily. Does any of the other panelists have a response or something to add before we take a couple more questions directly from our audience? I'll go ahead and chime. The first one that came in was they're asking for thoughts. It's Benjamin Flowers' question. Thank you. Thoughts about the corporate logic that drives TV broadcasting rights and how that relates to sports as a force for social change. Open question for anyone on the panel. It's kind of a different side of political power on the corporate side of power, maybe.
Well, I would just say quickly that there's a phenomenon that's happening right now in sports, which I would describe, which I never thought I'd necessarily see when I started doing this kind of work. And I would describe that as woke capitalism. And it's this idea where I'm going to go beyond the broadcasting and go to the teams, the executives, the entire structure of sports. They're all in a competition. And this is what I could never have foreseen 15, 20 years ago. They're all in this competition for the generation that was born after the year 2000. And that generation is really interesting as a cultural marker. That generation is more demographically diverse, arguably more ready to protest, and definitely less tolerant of intolerance than any generation that we've seen in the history of this country. And this generation also has a tremendous amount of competition for their attention, whether you're talking about 24-hour news channels, whether you're talking about TikTok, whether you're talking about Instagram. I mean, whether you're talking about the thousands of streaming services, it seems like, that are out there, there's a competition for their attention. And sports is an aging operation. The average age of a baseball fan is 57, but in the NFL, it's 37. So even in the popular NFL, we're headed towards not exactly something that's 20-somethings, teenagers are heavily invested in. And so I think these corporations, they understand that if they're going to attract this audience, they can't stand for nothing. They have to show that they are of what is happening in the minds of that generation. Is it sincere? No, I don't think so. I don't think it's sincere. But can it produce a set of circumstances that opens up space for people to protest and speak? Yeah, I think it could. And then you get situations like Major League Baseball, an incredibly conservative organization, moving its all-star game out of Georgia and moving it to Denver. I mean, I think that when you see something like that happen, it shows the amount of pressure that's on these corporations to actually act and behave in a certain way that meets the expectations of this young generation. I want to repeat what I said. I don't think this is sincere. I don't think that Nike is somehow this just corporation. Quite the opposite. If you read my writing, you'll know that. But I think that the space that's being created, I think it's just going to give more confidence, not only to athletes, but also to young people to feel like they're on the right side of history when they take to the streets.
Thanks, Dave. By the way, there was a question that came in almost as you were talking, I think, about woke capitalism. So you killed two birds with one stone on that. Hey, and you wrote this week about how quickly the Minnesota teams canceled and delayed games. That's kind of fits the analysis you were just given.
Absolutely. I mean, I went back and I've done research, and I bet you've done this research too, Doug, when looking at what happened with the LA teams during the LA uprising in 1992. And the most you saw was the Lakers moving to play a game in Vegas because the forum where they played was too close to the fires. So there's no social conscience coming from sports. There was no social conscience coming from athletes in 1992. I mean, so the game has changed, and it's something that's being recognized, I think, from top to bottom in the sports industry.
There's another question came in. I want to put this one out there, and Mikhail and Royce, jump in when you're ready, either on this question or other topics. Do you guys feel like athletes nowadays are less likely to fight for social change because they're so worried that their bottom line will be affected, as opposed to athletes back in the day who couldn't really enjoy the fruits of their labors because they were forced to fight for more social change? So about athletes, what do you think about that one? That was another one from our audience. Royce, Royce, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, absolutely. I know you got something to say on this one.
Yeah, I think there's it's no one thing, right? I think that the domination of sports, at least as it pertains to Black men in the sports where Black men have been very dominant, both commercially and performance-wise, I think there's a lot of things that go into their choices to be active in a certain manner. I think that, you take a person like myself or Lebron or Kaepernick or anybody else, we always have to consider, or we've been conditioned to consider, what it means to appease a white power structure and how to exist in that, how to navigate that, how to be successful at that, and often weigh what financial gain can come. Sorry, I clicked out for a second. Do you guys hear me still?
You're still with us, thanks.
Okay. What financial gain can come from, towing the line, but then also what that means for us in the long term as a community, as Black athletes. So, I would say that the bottom line is murky. What is the bottom line? And to go back to what Dave said, I definitely do see that the culture is changing. What I would caution the people, and what I've said to Dave and Doug, and any time I'm speaking on this issue, is we have to be very careful about our assessment and evaluation of time and what's an acceptable rate of progress, right? And so, times may be different culturally than they were in the 60s, or than they were in the 90s, or than they were in 2010. And things may be going in the right direction, maybe not. And anytime you have a culture that starts to shift to appease their bottom line, I'm concerned, right? Because I don't think true moral progress comes from any type of circumstance that is based on immoral goals or immoral visions or immoral worldviews. Right. And that's kind of my gripe with the NBA is, they talk race, inclusion, they talk race values, they talk about caring. But if we look at their ownership structure, and you can go right down the line from a Donald Sterling and Mark Cuban and some of the other names that have hit the airways to some of those who are more covert in their dealings, such as a Jeannie Buss, who is touted as this very progressive NBA owner now, probably partially because she's a bit younger and a woman, and she's living in that new culture we're talking about. But she was groomed and conditioned under her father, who none of us could reasonably believe isn't racist, right? And so, none of this progress is coming fast enough to save Dante Wright, and that's where my problem comes in. I don't really find this slow walk to justice or this slow walk to freedom to be efficacious, not only for Black lives and Black bodies like Dante Wright, but I don't find it to be efficacious for America as a country, economically, socially, and certainly not in the existential, spiritually. So none of it's good enough. None of it's fast enough. And the bottom line, and that's really the bottom line.
Yeah. So there's another question I want to throw out. Anybody can jump on it. It's actually two parts, but first part is from an anonymous attendee, so thank you. What needs to happen to make sports more equitable? We've been talking a lot about sports' role in society. So question, what needs to happen to make sport more equitable, and especially with respect to promoting interracial solidarity? So those of you who are inside of sports institutions and worlds, that's a question of that sort. Any thoughts on that one in particular? Can I say one thing on that? I think one of the things that I have written about a lot, starting with my book in the '68 Olympic protest, is I think sports is very effective as a site for dramatizing, signaling social issues, pushing for social change. But it's actually really hard to make change in society through sports. But where there is more efficacy is within your own halls. And so even when I look back to '68, I think Smith and Carlos did a lot in symbolic and communicative and dramaturgical ways to signal the limitations of the civil rights movement and the need for continued social justice. But it was hard to say exactly what changed in society. But it is easier to see that there were some things that happened in the sport world. Not near enough, Royce, not fast enough, but some things started to change because it's within the halls of your own institutions, your own house, that you've got some leverage. So I don't know if that's something that people can think with a little bit, and hear kind of how sport, in making itself more equitable and just, can be a statement in itself and a model for other institutions to follow.
Well, yeah, I'll say this. I think it's very hard to separate sports from the politics in any form or fashion, because the people who dominate sports at a decision-making level are so influenced by their own political ideologies. So it's very hard, let's say, to tell an MBA, in my own situation, for example, to look at the mental health topic as something that would even be maybe profitable for them, right? That would even maybe be something that's beneficial for their players who rely so much on having a healthy mind state going into competition, and maybe even elevate the brand that which we talk about becoming more and more bland due to being overly corporate. And they couldn't bring themselves to accept the possibility that a mental health acknowledgement would maybe benefit them because of all of the baked in ideologies around power, but specifically power over Black men and the fear of young Black competent men being politically inept. So, I think it's hard to separate the two, especially this late in the game, and so to make it equitable, I would say that the fan base, which is such a coveted element of sports and to sports owners and organizations, have to become much more in tune with and keeping track of where these institutions stand morally, or around, equitable topics of being equitable. And I'm not even saying that would make them change, because I honestly, to be quite honest, I think a lot of these professional teams and their owners are so egotistical and so power driven that they're willing to sacrifice money in order to maintain the cultural pecking order. And I actually would say, as I did in your class, that the greatest example of systemic racism in this country is not police killing Black people out on the streets. That's the most blatant. But the best example is that a white economy is willing to subvert its own vitality in order to suppress a Black economy, or the rise of a Black economy. So in that sense, you see that there really is no bottom line anymore when it comes to racism, that capitalism actually will subvert its own interests in certain situations to keep a desired group of people down or in a certain position.
Thanks, Royce. Dave, did you want to jump in on that one?
Well, just so interesting hearing what Royce said. Reminds me of something I was in another Zoom call earlier today, and we were talking about how the NCAA literally shoots itself in the foot. Not literally, it figuratively shoots itself in the foot when it comes to women's sports. Because, women's sports could be a profit center for the NCAA. If you look at things like impressions on Instagram of women's basketball players in the NCAA, they kick the men's butts. There's an actual interest there that the NCAA does not try to investigate and understand and facilitate precisely because of sexism. And so it's like, so sexism actually subverts what could be from a capitalistic perspective, something much more effective. But also just really quick about the power of sports in terms of making these changes. I mean, Royce White spoke about mental health and capitalism as being a national crisis on ESPN. Colin Kaepernick gave a generation of young people, young athletes, a language by which they could express their dissent when it comes to police violence, racist police violence. I mean, Billie Jean King inspired a generation of women when she beat Bobby Riggs. I mean, this is the power of sports. Jackie Robinson taking the field. That's the power of sports. Muhammad Ali opposing the war. I mean, that's the power. I think we run into trouble when we see these instances of justice within sports, and then we expect Royce White to somehow solve the mental health crisis in this country. Or we think Colin Kaepernick's going to end racism, or Billie Jean King's going to end sexism. I mean, that's where we run into trouble, when we start to see sports as a substitute for social movements. Because social movements is what changes the world. That's what changes the world. And athletes can be amazing amplifiers of those movements. And we should hold them up, specifically because so many people try to push them down when they do try to speak out. But we need to remember where the cart is and where the horse is in this equation of how we understand what's happening. And we have to understand that movements is what pulls it along, but athletes do play this role in terms of being able to then shape those movements through their own activism and courage.
Dave, that was awesome. Also, several impressive metaphors along the way there. Great figures of speech. And Mikkel was typing at you on all caps on one of those points. Mikkel, did you want to say something about, was that the first part of what Dave was talking about for women's sports?
Yeah, I mean, we watched what happened at the NCAA this year and the women and it being blown up. I mean, I study social media, so like, absolutely, this is what it takes, right? I find it interesting though, because then it went from like, oh, this is great. But you know who didn't provide those women those dumbbells in that space? Not the NCAA, Dick's Sporting Goods, Big Lots, McDonald's. Everyone else said, you know what? You're not gonna call us sexist. Let's chip in. The NCAA said nothing. They said, all right, if you want to give them dumbbells, give them dumbbells. And I don't see the NCAA now saying, you know what, you're right. Like women should have equal space, right, to work out. We should provide the women more dumbbells and better meals. But that doesn't just happen in the NCAA tournament. We saw that happen with the women. Women weren't eating because they asked for vegan options and got troughs of meat, right? Women were had allergy restrictions and weren't having their needs met. So I mean, it's just so deeply embedded in our society that, I mean, I think it's a double, to me, it's unfortunate because I feel like it becomes this double negative, right? Like there's sexism and we know that, but like the sexism for women in sport is just a whole, another beast that we have to try to conquer. I'm battling sexism, but like you also don't really think I should be playing because you don't think I'm qualified or well fit or think I should be doing other things with my talent. So I'm all there. You know, every time Dave mentions the NCAA and the women, I'm always giving him all caps.
And I like the emphasis on institutions, which is a little bit of a lead to another question that came in about different leagues and their role. So here, I'll read you the question. I want to add a bit to it, but it says, what do you guys think about the NBA being this democratic entity versus the NFL being this Republican one in terms of how they represent themselves and how they respond to social movements? Or are they both white supremacy entities where one is covert and the other is overt? Anybody want to take that on?
I mean, real quick, I feel like, Doug, we just talked about this. When a lot of these institutions are built in white supremacy. I mean, I always think it's interesting because we do say that, and it's like, oh, well, like, you know, there's more Black men in the WNBA. I mean, in the NBA, there are a lot of Black men in the NFL. And, you know, like, it's a stretch to say that the NFL is built off of Black men only, you know, but still, there are Black men in the NFL. I don't see why there's any difference, right? But to quickly wrap up, I would just say that we have to be mindful that these institutions, all of them, from the NFL to universities are built and structured in a space of white supremacy.
I was also going to add,
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I was
No,
going
you
to
go
say,
ahead, Mary.
thank you. I was saying that I think their histories are different too. So if we go back to, as the NBA started to have more African Americans as their playing force, the white audience withdrew. And so the NBA had to do some clever marketing to represent guys as more palatable to white audiences and challenge stereotypes that get associated to Black guys' bodies. So they've done sort of, people have talked about the Disneyification of the NBA to sort of make these guys a little bit seemingly palatable to whites. So they sort of play off of that fear, that white fear that's connected to white supremacy, but then try to make guys palatable. So in that situation, the Players Association had a little bit more tighter partnership with the league. I mean, the finals one year were not even on broadcast live. So they had to sort of work together with the league to try to promote the sport. So I think they have a different set of labor relations too. And again, we could critique how good they are, but they're definitely stronger than the labor relations that happen in the NFL. So my sense is there's white supremacy there, but there's also labor relations in there and racialized labor. And I also think in some cases, I think about the Sterling case. I think NBA ownership was afraid that the players were going to withdraw their labor in ways that other strikes or whatever that were around just economics would play out much differently. So I think there is a sense of that. Whereas in football, I'm not saying there aren't stars, but I mean, you got, I don't know, 1,700 guys or whatever. You've got a lot of bodies you can just run through there, where there isn't as much elite talent, I don't know, in the world around. I'm sure you could run through guys in there, but I think the sports are different. I think the histories are different. And it appears to be Democrat and Republican, but I think it's all about labor and race, racialized labor, and how it gets played out differently in these histories.
Mary, I know we're running short on time, but I can't help but ask, since you've written on it, where's the WNBA fit on this?
I think it's very similar. I think they're now seeing that they need to have a partnership to grow the game. But historically, obviously, the women have hardly made anything, but their last collective bargaining has moved them up a little bit. But we did know when the players were trying to think about not playing after the shooting of Blake, the commissioner was there. Oh, we support them, but we want them to play. We support them, but we want them to play, right? So I think there's a slightly different dynamic in that the women also know they're trying to build something, much as, you know, back 20, 30 years ago when the NBA was kind of teetering, the players knew they had to build something again. So I see that there might be some parallels back through the history.
Yeah, thanks. Royce, I know you were trying to get in. We're very close to the end, so you probably can work your way into having the final word here. But if you could keep it tight, I know when we do interviews, I ask you a question and usually have to run the recorder for about a half an hour. If you want a final word here, I think we're right at that moment, because I did see you were going to get in on that question a moment ago.
Yeah, I think, you know, for me, I hear that a lot. I talk about the juxtaposition between the NFL and NBA in my book, in my letter to Lebron, because he had a comment on it. And I'll just say that I think we see these two spectrums, right, of racism on one side and being more just on the other side. And I think somewhere along that line, more towards just, but still on the side, on this side, the wrong side of the line of dishonest, lies not only these chameleonic professional sports leagues and their owners, but also a lot of Black athletes who have made the conscious choice to go along with the chameleon, like Dave said, the show, as you would call it, of justice and equality and forward thinking. And I think that those are the two most dangerous players in this whole game, right? I think that the white supremacy is pretty much is it's pretty much socially unacceptable, although now we're seeing a resurgence where it's starting to kick back up, where we're worried about whether or not it is socially unacceptable anymore. But I think for the most part, you can bring common minds to denounce the most extreme versions. I know we talk Donald Trump, and that would be a whole nother thing, but prior and aside from that, and I'm not downplaying that, but what I'm most worried about is where the line of progress will actually fall with the chameleons that portray or claim progress, and the other Blacks who are complicit in that that kind of smoke and mirrors for their own gain, for security and whatnot.
Thanks, Royce. Thanks everybody for a wonderful panel. I think Mikhail was kind of joking, we're just getting started. That does feel true, but I think it's been pretty good throughout. I want to thank the panelists in particular for their passion, for their emotion, their thoughtfulness, and their analysis. Thank the audience for being so attentive and having such great questions, and encourage us all to take this knowledge, this perspective, this commitment that we've seen, use that in our lives, use that not only in our fandom, but in our activity as citizens in the constant push for justice and social change. Thanks, everyone.